4. November 20th, 1923. Postulates of Linguistics. 1. Language is informational and communicational. When the schoolmistress instructs her students on a rule of grammar or arithmetic, she is not informing them any more than she is informing herself when she questions a student. She does not so much instruct as, in sign, give orders or commands. A teacher's commands are not external or additional to what he or she teaches us. They do not flow from primary significations or result from information. An order always and already concerns prior orders, which is why ordering is redundancy. The compulsory education machine does not communicate information. It imposes upon the child semiotic coordinates possessing all of the dual foundations of grammar: masculine, feminine, singular, plural, noun, verb, subject of the statement, subject of enunciation, etc. The elementary unit of language, the statement, is the order word. Rather than common sense, a faculty for the centralization of information, we must define an abominable faculty consisting in emitting, receiving, and transmitting order words. Language is made not to be believed, but to be obeyed, and to compel obedience. The Baroness has not the slightest intention of convincing me of her sincerity. She is simply indicating that she prefers to see me pretend to agree. We see this in police or government announcements, which often have little plausibility or truthfulness, but say very clearly what should be observed and retained. The indifference to any kind of credibility exhibited by these announcements often verges on provocation. This is proof that the issue lies elsewhere. Let people say. That is all language demands. Spengler notes that the fundamental forms of speech are not the statement of a judgment or the expression of a feeling, but the command, the expression of obedience, the assertion, the question, the affirmation or negation, very short phrases that command life and are inseparable from enterprises and large-scale projects. Ready? Yes. Go ahead. Words are not tools, but we give children language, pens, and notebooks as we give workers shovels and pickaxes. A rule of grammar is a power marker before it is a syntactical marker. The order does not refer to prior significations or to a prior organization of distinctive units. Quite the opposite. Information is only the strict minimum necessary for the emission, transmission, and observation of orders as commands. One must be just informed enough not to confuse fire with for, or to avoid the unfortunate situation of the teacher and the student, as described by Lewis Carroll. The teacher at the top of the stairs asks a question that is passed on by servants, who distort it at each step of the way, and the student, below in the courtyard, returns an answer that is also distorted at each stage of the trip back. Language is not life. It gives life orders. Life does not speak. It listens and waits. Every order word, even a father's to his son, carries a little death sentence, a judgment, as Kafka put it. The hard part is to specify the status and scope of the order word. It is not a question of the origin of language, since the order word is only a language function, a function coextensive with language. If language always seems to presuppose itself, if we cannot assign it a non-linguistic point of departure, it is because language does not operate between something seen or felt and something said, but always goes from saying to saying. We believe that narrative consists not in communicating what one has seen, but in transmitting what one has heard, what someone else said to you. Hearsay. It does not even suffice to invoke a vision distorted by passion. The first language, or rather the first determination of language, is not the trope or metaphor, but indirect discourse. The importance some have accorded metaphor and metonymy proves disastrous for the study of language. Metaphors and metonymies are merely effects. They are a part of language only when they presuppose indirect discourse. There are many passions in a passion, all manner of voices in a voice, murmurings, speaking in tongues. That is why all discourse is indirect, and the translative movement proper to language is that of indirect discourse. Benveniste denies that the bee has language, even though it has an organic coding process and even uses tropes. It has no language because it can communicate what it has seen, but not transmit what has been communicated to it. A bee that has seen a food source can communicate the message to bees that did not see it, but a bee that has not seen it cannot transmit the message to others that did not see it. Language is not content to go from a first party to a second party, from one who has seen to one who has not, but necessarily goes from a second party to a third party, neither of whom has seen. It is in this sense that language is the transmission of the word as order word, not the communication of a sign as information. Language is a map, not a tracing. But how can the order word be a function coextensive with language when the order, the command, seems tied to a restricted type of explicit proposition, marked by the imperative? Austin's famous theses clearly demonstrate that the various extrinsic relations between action and speech by which a statement can describe an action in an indicative mode, or incite it in an imperative mode, etc., are not all there is. There are also intrinsic relations between speech and certain actions that are accomplished by saying them. The performative, I swear by saying I swear. And more generally between speech and certain actions that are accomplished in speaking. The illocutionary, I ask a question by saying is. I make a promise by saying I love you. I give a command by using the imperative, etc. These acts internal to speech, these immanent relations between statements and acts, have been termed implicit or non-discursive presuppositions, as opposed to the potentially explicit assumptions by which a statement refers to other statements or an external action. Ducrot. The theory of the performative sphere and the broader sphere of the illocutionary has had three important and immediate consequences. 1. It has made it impossible to conceive of language as a code, since a code is the condition of possibility for all explanation. It has also made it impossible to conceive of speech as the communication of information. To order, question, promise, or affirm is not to inform someone about a command, doubt, engagement, or assertion, but to effectuate these specific, immanent, and necessarily implicit acts. It has made it impossible to define semantics, syntactics, or even phonematics as scientific zones of language independent of pragmatics. Pragmatics ceases to be a trash heap. Pragmatic determinations cease to be subject to the alternative, fall outside language, or answer to explicit conditions that syntacticize and semanticize pragmatic determinations. Instead, pragmatics becomes the presupposition behind all of the other dimensions and insinuates itself into everything. 3. It makes it impossible to maintain the distinction between language and speech because speech can no longer be defined simply as the extrinsic and individual use of a primary signification or the variable application of a pre-existing syntax. Quite the opposite. The meaning and syntax of language can no longer be defined independently of the speech acts they presuppose. It is true that it is still difficult to see how speech acts or implicit presuppositions can be considered a function coextensive with language. It is all the more difficult if one starts with the performative, that which one does by saying it, and moves by extension to the illocutionary, that which one does in speaking. For it is always possible to thwart that move. The performative can be walled in by explaining it by specific syntactic and semantic characteristics, avoiding any recourse to a generalized pragmatics. According to Benveniste, for example, the performative relates not to acts, but instead to a property of self-referentiality of terms. The true personal pronouns, I, you, defined as shifters. By this account, a pre-existent structure of subjectivity or intersubjectivity in language, rather than presupposing speech acts, is adequate to account for them. Benveniste thus defines language as communicational rather than informational. This properly linguistic intersubjectivity, or subjectification, explains all the rest. In other words, everything that is brought into being by saying it. The question is whether subjective communication is any better a linguistic notion than ideal information. Oswald Ducrot has set forth the reasons that have led him to reverse Benveniste's schema. The phenomenon of self-referentiality cannot account for the performative. The opposite is the case. It is the fact that certain statements are socially devoted to the accomplishment of certain actions that explains self-referentiality. The performative itself is explained by the illocutionary, not the opposite. It is the illocutionary that constitutes the non-discursive or implicit presuppositions, and the illocutionary is in turn explained by collective assemblages of enunciation, by juridical acts or equivalents of juridical acts, which, far from depending on subjectification, proceedings, or assignations of subjects in language, in fact determine their distribution. Communication is no better a concept than information. Intersubjectivity gets us no further than signifiance in accounting for these statements acts, assemblages that in each language delimit the role and range of subjective morphemes. We will see that the analysis of indirect discourse confirms this point of view, since it shows that subjectifications are not primary, but result from a complex assemblage. We call order words not a particular category of explicit statements, for example in the imperative, but the relation of every word or every statement to implicit presuppositions, in other words, to speech acts that are, and can only be, accomplished in the statement. Order words do not concern commands only, but every act that is linked to statements by a social obligation. Every statement displays this link, directly or indirectly. Questions, promises, are order words. The only possible definition of language is the set of all order words, implicit presuppositions, or speech acts current in a language at a given moment. The relation between the statement and the act is internal, immanent, but it is not one of identity. Rather, it is a relation of redundancy. The order word itself is the redundancy of the act and the statement. Newspapers, news, proceed by redundancy, in that they tell us what we must think, retain, expect, etc. Language is neither informational nor communicational. It is not the communication of information, but something quite different, the transmission of order words, either from one statement to another or within each statement, insofar as each statement accomplishes an act, and the act is accomplished in the statement. The most general schema of information science posits, in principle, an ideal state of maximum information, and makes redundancy merely a limitative condition serving to decrease this theoretical maximum in order to prevent it from being drowned out by noise. We are saying that the redundancy of the order word is instead primary, and that information is only the minimal condition for the transmission of order words, which is why the opposition to be made is not between noise and information, but between all the indisciplines at work in language, and the order word as discipline or grammaticality. Redundancy has two forms, frequency and resonance. The first concerns the signifiance of information. The second, I equals I, concerns the subjectivity of communication. It becomes apparent that information and communication, and even signifiance and subjectification, are subordinate to redundancy. A distinction is sometimes made between information and communication. Some authors envision an abstract signifiance of information and an abstract subjectification of communication. None of this, however, yields an implicit or primary form of language. There is no signifiance independent of dominant significations, nor is there subjectification independent of an established order of subjection. Both depend on the nature and transmission of order words in a given social field. There is no individual enunciation. There is not even a subject of enunciation. Yet relatively few linguists have analyzed the necessarily social character of enunciation. The problem is that it is not enough to establish that enunciation has this social character, since it could be extrinsic. Therefore, too much or too little is said about it. The social character of enunciation is intrinsically founded only if one succeeds in demonstrating how enunciation, in itself, implies collective assemblages. It then becomes clear that the statement is individuated and enunciation subjectified. only to the extent that an impersonal collective assemblage requires it and determines it to be so. It is for this reason that indirect discourse, especially free indirect discourse, is of exemplary value. There are no clear, distinctive contours. What comes first is not an insertion of variously individuated statements or an interlocking of different subjects of enunciation, but a collective assemblage resulting in the determination of relative subjectification proceedings or assignations of individuality and their shifting distributions within discourse. Indirect discourse is not explained by the distinction between subjects. Rather, it is the assemblage, as it freely appears in this discourse, that explains all the voices present within a single voice. The glimmer of girls in a monologue by Charlus, the languages in a language, the order words in a word. The American murderer, Son of Sam, killed on a prompting of an ancestral voice, itself transmitted through the voice of a dog. The notion of collective assemblage of enunciation takes on a primary importance, since it is what must account for the social character. We can no doubt define the collective assemblage as the redundant complex of the act and the statement that necessarily accomplishes it. But this is still only a nominal definition. It does not even enable us to justify our previous position that redundancy is irreducible to a simple identity, or that there is no simple identity between the statement and the act. If we wish to move to a real definition of the collective assemblage, we must ask of what consist these acts immanent to language that are in redundancy with statements or constitute order words. These acts seem to be defined as the set of all incorporeal transformations current in a given society and attributed to the bodies of that society. We may take the word body in its broadest sense. There are mental bodies, souls are bodies, etc. We must, however, distinguish between the actions and passions affecting those bodies and acts, which are only non-corporeal attributes of the expressed of a statement. When Ducrot asks what an act consists of, he turns precisely to the juridical assemblage, taking the example of the judge's sentence that transforms the accused into a convict. In effect, what takes place beforehand, the crime of which someone is accused, and what takes place after, the carrying out of the penalty, are actions, passions, affecting bodies. The body of the property, the body of the victim, the body of the convict, the body of the prison. But the transformation of the accused into a convict is a pure instantaneous act, or incorporeal attribute, that is the expressed of the judge's sentence. Peace and war are states or interminglings of very different kinds of bodies. But the declaration of a general mobilization expresses an instantaneous and incorporeal transformation of bodies. Bodies have an age, they mature and grow old, but majority, retirement, any given age category, are incorporeal transformations that are immediately attributed to bodies in particular societies. You are no longer a child. This statement concerns an incorporeal transformation, even if it applies to bodies, and inserts itself into their actions and passions. The incorporeal transformation is recognizable by its instantaneousness, its immediacy, by the simultaneity of the statement expressing the transformation and the effect the transformation produces. That is why order words are precisely dated, to the hour, minute, and second, and take effect the moment they are dated. Love is an intermingling of bodies that can be represented by a heart with an arrow through it, by a union of souls, etc. But the declaration, I love you, expresses a non-corporeal attribute of bodies, the lover's as well as that of the loved one. Eating bread and drinking wine are interminglings of bodies. Communing with Christ is also an intermingling of bodies, properly spiritual bodies that are no less real for being spiritual. But the transformation of the body, of the bread and the wine, into the body and blood of Christ is the pure expressed of a statement attributed to the bodies. In an airplane hijacking, the threat of a hijacker brandishing a revolver is obviously an action. So is the execution of the hostages, if it occurs. But the transformation of the passengers into hostages, and of the plane body into a prison body, is an instantaneous incorporeal transformation, a mass media act, in the sense in which the English speak of speech acts. The order words or assemblages of enunciation in a given society, in short, the illocutionary, designate this instantaneous relation between statements and the incorporeal transformations or non-corporeal attributes they express. The instantaneousness of the order word, which can be projected to infinity, placed at the origin of society, is quite strange. For Rousseau, for example, the passage from the state of nature to the social state is like a leap in place, an incorporeal transformation occurring at 0 hour. Real history undoubtedly recounts the actions and passions of the bodies that develop in a social field. It communicates them in a certain fashion, but it also transmits order words. In other words, pure acts intercalated into that development. History will never be rid of dates. Perhaps economics or financial analysis best demonstrates the presence and instantaneousness of these decisive acts in an overall process. That is why statements definitely do not belong to ideology, but are already at work in what is supposedly the domain of the economic base. The galloping inflation in Germany after 1918 was a crisis affecting the monetary body, and many other bodies besides, but the sum of the circumstances suddenly made possible a semiotic transformation that, although indexed to the body of the earth and material assets, was still a pure act or incorporeal transformation. November 20th, 1923. The assemblages are in constant variation, are themselves constantly subject to transformations. First, the circumstances must be taken into account. Benveniste clearly demonstrates that a performative statement is nothing outside of the circumstances that make it performative. Anybody can shout, "I declare a general mobilization," but in the absence of an effectuated variable giving that person the right to make such a statement, it is an act of puerility or insanity, not an act of enunciation. This is also true of "I love you," which has neither meaning nor subject nor addressee outside of circumstances that not only give it credibility, but make it a veritable assemblage, a power marker, even in the case of an unhappy love. It is still by a will to power that one obeys. The general term circumstances should not leave the impression that it is a question only of external circumstances. "I swear" is not the same when said in the family, at school, in a love affair, in a secret society, or in court. It is not the same thing, and neither is it the same statement. It is not the same bodily situation, and neither is it the same incorporeal transformation. The transformation applies to bodies, but is itself incorporeal, internal to enunciation. There are variables of expression that establish a relation between language and the outside, but precisely because they are immanent to language. As long as linguistics confines itself to constants, whether syntactical, morphological, or phonological, it ties the statement to a signifier and enunciation to a subject, and accordingly botches the assemblage. It consigns circumstances to the exterior, closes language in on itself, and makes pragmatics a residue. Pragmatics, on the other hand, does not simply appeal to external circumstances. It brings to light variables of expression or of enunciation that are so many internal reasons for language not to close itself off. As Vološinov, Bakhtin, says, as long as linguistics extracts constants, it is incapable of helping us understand how a single word can be a complete enunciation. There must be an extra something that remains outside of the scope of the entire set of linguistic categories and definitions, even though it is still entirely within the purview of the theory of enunciation or language. The order word is precisely that variable that makes the word, as such, an enunciation. The instantaneousness of the order word, its immediacy, gives it a power of variation in relation to the bodies to which the transformation is attributed. Pragmatics is a politics of language. A study such as Jean-Pierre Faye's on the constitution of Nazi statements in the German social field is, in this respect, exemplary, and cannot be directly transferred to the constitution of fascist statements in Italy. Transformational research of this kind is concerned with the variation of the order words and non-corporeal attributes linked to social bodies and effectuating immanent acts. We may take, as another example, under different conditions, the formation of a properly Leninist type of statement in Soviet Russia, basing ourselves on a text by Lenin entitled On Slogans, 1917. This text constituted an incorporeal transformation that extracted from the masses a proletarian class as an assemblage of enunciation before the conditions were first present for the proletariat to exist as a body. A stroke of genius from the first Marxist International, which invented a new type of class. Workers of the world, unite. Taking advantage of the break with the Social Democrats, Lenin invented, or decreed, yet another incorporeal transformation that extracted from the proletarian class a vanguard as an assemblage of enunciation, and was attributed to the party, a new type of party as a distinct body, at the risk of falling into a properly bureaucratic system of redundancy. The Leninist wager, an act of audacity? Lenin declared that the slogan, mot d'ordre, all power to the Soviets, was valid only from the 27th of February to the 4th of July for the peacetime development of the revolution, and no longer held in the state of war. The passage from peace to war implied this transformation, not just from the masses to a guiding proletariat, but from the proletariat to a directing vanguard. July 4th, exactly, the power of the Soviets came to an end. All of the external circumstances can be assigned, the war as well as the insurrection that forced Lenin to flee to Finland. But the fact remains that the incorporeal transformation was uttered on the 4th of July, prior to the organization of the body to which it would be attributed, namely the party itself. Every particular slogan must be deduced from the totality of the specific features of a definite political situation. If the objection is leveled that these specific features pertain to politics and not linguistics, it must be observed how thoroughly politics works language from within, causing not only the vocabulary but also the structure and all of the phrasal elements to vary as the order words change. A type of statement can be evaluated only as a function of its pragmatic implications, in other words, in relation to the implicit presuppositions, immanent acts, or incorporeal transformations it expresses and which introduce new configurations of bodies. True intuition is not a judgment of grammaticality, but an evaluation of internal variables of enunciation in relation to the aggregate of the circumstances. We have gone from explicit commands to order words as implicit presuppositions, from order words to the immanent acts or incorporeal transformations they express, and from there to the assemblages of enunciation whose variables they are. To the extent these variables enter at a given moment into determinable relations, the assemblages combine in a regime of signs or a semiotic machine. It is obvious that a society is plied by several semiotics, that its regimes are in fact mixed. Moreover, at a later time there will arise new order words that will modify the variables and will not yet be part of a known regime. Thus the order word is redundancy in several ways, as a function of the process of transmission essential to it, and in itself, from the time it is emitted, in its immediate relation with the act or transformation it effectuates. The order word is already redundancy even when it is in rupture with a particular semiotic. That is why every statement of a collective assemblage of enunciation belongs to indirect discourse. Indirect discourse is the presence of a reported statement within the reporting statement, the presence of an order word within the word. Language in its entirety is indirect discourse. Indirect discourse in no way supposes direct discourse. Rather, the latter is extracted from the former, to the extent that the operations of signifiance and proceedings of subjectification in an assemblage are distributed, attributed, and assigned, or that the variables of the assemblage enter into constant relations, however temporarily. Direct discourse is a detached fragment of a mass and is born of the dismemberment of the collective assemblage. But the collective assemblage is always like the murmur from which I take my proper name, the constellation of voices, concordant or not, from which I draw my voice. I always depend on a molecular assemblage of enunciation that is not given in my conscious mind, any more than it depends solely on my apparent social determinations, which combine many heterogeneous regimes of signs. Speaking in tongues. To write is perhaps to bring this assemblage of the unconscious to the light of day, to select the whispering voices, to gather the tribes and secret idioms from which I extract something I call myself, moi. I is an order word. A schizophrenic said, I heard voices say he is conscious of life. In this sense, there is indeed a schizophrenic cogito, but it is a cogito that makes self-consciousness the incorporeal transformation of an order word, or a result of indirect discourse. My direct discourse is still the free indirect discourse running through me, coming from other worlds or other planets. That is why so many artists and writers have been tempted by the seance table. When we ask what faculty is specific to the order word, we must indeed attribute to it some strange characteristics, a kind of instantaneousness in the emission, perception, and transmission of order words, a wide variability, and a power of forgetting, permitting one to feel absolved of the order words one has followed, and then abandoned in order to welcome others. A properly ideal or ghostly capacity for the apprehension of incorporeal transformations, an aptitude for grasping language as an immense indirect discourse, the faculty of the cuer and the cued, of the song that always holds a tune within a tune in a relation of redundancy, a faculty that is in truth mediumistic, glossolalia, or xenoglossic. Let us return to the question of how this defines a language function, a function coextensive with language. It is evident that order words, collective assemblages, or regimes of signs cannot be equated with language, but they effectuate its condition of possibility, the superlinearity of expression. They fulfill in each instance this condition of possibility. Without them, language would remain a pure virtuality, the superlinear character of indirect discourse. Doubtless, the assemblages vary, undergo transformation, but they do not necessarily vary by language. They do not correspond to the various languages. A language seems to be defined by the syntactical, semantic, phonological constants in its statements. The collective assemblage, on the contrary, concerns the usage of these constants in relation to variables internal to enunciation itself, variables of expression, immanent acts, or incorporeal transformations. Different constants, different languages, may have the same usage. The same constants in a given language may have different usages, successively or even simultaneously. We cannot content ourselves with a duality between constants as linguistic factors that are explicit or potentially explicit, and variables as extrinsic, non-linguistic factors. For the pragmatic variables of usage are internal to enunciation and constitute the implicit presuppositions of language. Thus, if the collective assemblage is in each instance coextensive with the linguistic system considered, and to language as a whole, it is because it expresses the set of incorporeal transformations that effectuate the condition of possibility of language and utilize the elements of the linguistic system. The language function, thus defined, is neither informational nor communicational. It has to do neither with signifying information nor with intersubjective communication, and it is useless to abstract a signifiance outside information or a subjectivity outside communication. For the subjectification proceedings and movement of signifiance relate to regimes of signs or collective assemblages. The language function is the transmission of order words, and order words relate to assemblages just as assemblages relate to the incorporeal transformations constituting the variables of the function. Linguistics is nothing without a pragmatics, semiotic or political, to define the effectuation of the condition of possibility of language and the usage of linguistic elements.